Hi everyone, welcome back to my next Free Tutorial Friday. The subject this week is based on a question or a comment I had on the YouTube channel, which was asking about form language or shape language. And I'm going to talk about that just briefly today and how to think about that probably mostly in the context of industrial design. So I have a lot of nice examples for that, and that's my area of expertise or education. And so let's get into the subject of form language and shape language. So we'll start with a little bit of history first, and I think if you look at modern day aesthetic projects, let's say video games, movies, furniture design, those sorts of things, a lot of times, let's say on a movie, a period of art history will be referenced to develop a form language for a culture. Say it's a science fiction movie. So a great place to start, and really today is just going to be all about referencing places to start, places to look, how to find inspiration, how to build your sort of visual library based on history, art history movements, which is a very classic way to build out an aesthetic brief, let's say, for a project. So the history of graphic design is a good place to start, just like art history. But if you take and say you start a movie project, a lot of times we'll say, you know, we want to do something that's based on Art Nouveau, and we want to understand the form language and the shape language of the Art Nouveau movement and what makes something look Art Nouveau. So a director, an art director, or a production designer will pull reference like this and say, you know what, let's try for this culture, this race of alien, as an example, or modern day, interpretation of a new product with new technology but an old aesthetic. If we modernized Art Nouveau today, what would it look like? So this is usually a good starting point, is art history. And you can see the same sort of ideas that apply to posters and furniture, and this is the focus of this is graphic design. So I think it's a great place to start is with history of graphic design, history of art. Graphic design, I think, is easier to interpret into objects. So if you're mainly if you're an industrial designer, graphic designer, or artist as well, but I think graphic design is a little bit easier to understand than art history. So I sort of steer people in that direction. You can also find books like this, The Look of the Century. And you can find a lot of those same graphic design examples then sort of converted or adapted to physical objects. And this is kind of nice, just a nice overview book that has references of an entire 100 years worth of all sorts of subjects. Clothing, jewelry, makeup, watches, appliances, vacuum cleaners, clocks, wallpaper, dolls, etc., etc., etc. So sort of everything you've been surrounded by over the last 100 years, you can find summarized in a good book. This one is put out by DK. It's quite old now, I think, but since the century ended about 13 years ago. But those are great. The reason why this is so important, the history of graphic design, the history of, how physical things look and the style that they were and where those styles came from, and a quick, what's nice about these are they're short, easy to understand, much more, especially if your English is a second language, this kind of thing is summarized in a nice way. Is that most audiences that you're going to be designing or creating your objects for, or your artwork, they're sort of a product of this history, of this visual history. So if you can reference this, a lot of times you can build upon that predetermined aesthetic that there's an audience for, or if you want to get more daring, you can try to mix and match those together. So I think it's important to always have this history to fall back on, and not even fall back on, but to build on, I should say. And the general public, when you're designing an object, one, you have to be adaptable. So when you're faced with a brief to design something, a product, let's say, for a certain audience, you actually know a lot about that audience and what they like and what they don't like. So if I was going to do, let's say, an off-road pickup truck for a company or a toy maker, let's say, I probably would not do Art Nouveau pickup truck. They just aren't going to go together. So, you can go and try to pick artistic movements of the past to build upon. And the other thing that's very important to keep in mind always when you're designing things or styling them is that the general public likes things that go together, right? So they like objects and, in a lot of cases, objects and styling to have a rhythm or a harmony. So if you stick with a certain movement, like Art Nouveau as an example, right, and you learn that graphic language and you apply it to your object, it will have a certain harmony and a rhythm, and those shapes will all relate to each other. And so if let's look at a couple of other examples. Let's take Kalani as an example of applying inspiration from nature to all of his design work over his entire career. So no matter what he's doing, he's always referencing back to nature for transportation, architecture, product design, all of his subjects. That's where he finds his inspiration for all of these, very interesting creations. And you can very, very clearly see, right, what his inspiration and what his influence is, and how he develops and where he finds his inspiration for his form language, his graphic applications, and his shape language, right, or shape design. And so that's one example. Let's find something that's maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum. Here, let's go Lebbeus Woods in the world of architecture to see sort of the opposite inspiration, which would be much more about a sort of deconstructivist aesthetic applied to his buildings and drawings and paintings. So, and that's, very, very simplified explanation of that, but that's the basic idea, is that, you can have the same sort of interest in composition, rendering, drawing, et cetera, and the only difference can be the forms that you're conveying. And you can end up with something very, very different, of course. Kalani versus, Lebbeus Woods is kind of the, I think, nice extremes. Nature and more the deconstructed industrial revolution. And so if we look about some other examples. So the idea there is that those are places to research, right? A lot of what I try to do on the YouTube channel on these quick videos is just to give you a path to go research more and try to understand simple ways to go and understand the craft of doing very subjective, abstract things like styling. So let's look at, Chris Ayres has a nice book, The Daily Zoo, and even for kids' drawing book, starts with really simple shape language. So round shapes versus triangular shapes, right, versus a mix. And so if I look at as one of my own examples, this series that I did for Liftoff, there's 108 of these little spaceship sketches at the back of this book. And each one was an exercise in trying to find a form language or a shape language that worked together for that concept. And then you can see like this has a certain rhythm to it where all these are all sort of Formula One inspired for the silhouettes. But then if you look to the interior forms and shapes, I basically just, when I start to do the sketch, I think, oh, I'm going to do all triangles or I'm going to do all straight lines. And here's a nice kind of overview you can see, right? Different harmony to the forms. And generally speaking, people are predisposed to expecting that if I have an angular silhouette, that also the cut lines and details and vents and window graphics will also be angular. That's a very straightforward, simple way to approach doing styling. With this one, for instance, right, if I've got these sort of flowing silhouettes, then also on the interior, people would expect to see my graphic lines also flowing, and then those complement the silhouette. And then here, much more angular, right? And then this one, much more sort of elliptical. This one sort of spindly, with my silhouette, and then so I have maybe some very fine graphic lines on the interior. So I think the general idea that will be appealing to the broadest audience is usually goes something like this. I'm going to do a little side view of spaceship, and I'm going to think triangles and straight lines. And so, you know, that little spaceship sketch might start and try to be limited, basically, using just those forms. And it's a nice exercise. And the other thing I like to do when I'm doing styling is if I do this little sketch, I'll try to do the exact opposite on the next page or just below it. And that will try to do maybe only elliptical forms. And you could reference, again, some art history. You can make up your own, right? You can try to be the next person to invent something like Cubism as a form language that can be applied to both sculpture, three-dimensional forms, and drawings, and paintings. That would be pretty exciting if you could do that. So that maybe there's another one on the other side. A little bit of perspective. So that's the basic idea. Triangles and straight lines, and then all my interior cut lines would be, right, other straight lines and triangles for the small surfacing. And then if we zoomed way in, we'd probably see little graphics and things that were triangles. So I might do the counterpoint to that, ellipses and flowing lines. So the next ship sketch might go something like this. And then all my interior details, all of my cut lines, my silhouette. Right, all of that tries to relate back and have some harmony. And I'm going to stay with the harmony because that's really going to be probably the most universally accepted, right, or expected aesthetic. So if all the shapes relate, it generally makes sense to people when they look at those objects. And you can, of course, do, you know, whatever you want and break. There are really no rules when it comes to styling, but there's general acceptance. And what you might design for a customer that's a very conservative base, right, or has conservative aesthetic tastes might be very different than what you try to design for your peer group of designers. If I design something for my peer group of designers, I might have to push something very, very abstract to get them interested. But if I want to do something for the general marketplace, of course, then I need to bring that back a bit. And the reason for that is that if you do too abstract, right, if we do something like, you know, oh, here's my spaceship, right? And I'm mixing things together. Now you might find something in there that's interesting, okay? But generally speaking, people aren't going to be able to form an idea about this because it's too abstract. And so what I mean by that is that if people can't look at that and say, oh, that's a cool version of so-and-so style, right? So it's so abstract, they can't even formulate a critique of it or an opinion. That's just different for different sake. It's not it's not familiar enough. So we had this thing in school called, and this is before the software program, Maya. And Maya is basically most advanced yet acceptable. So most advanced yet acceptable or accepted by the general public. And so you can't just do different for different sake. Right? Different for different sake is fun to do with artists and other designers to try and push yourself and get out of your comfort zone. But generally speaking, it's not going to be accepted by the broader public. So if your job is to do commercial design work or artwork, that's where referencing what's come before, right, and history can really be a great starting point and a great anchor for you to develop something that people in general will like, because they have certain expectations, and it's important to understand those expectations when you're trying to design and style something for a market and a customer. And that's the difference sort of between doing personal art, which maybe is, you know, over on this example, and doing something that's for a general audience. So I hope that helps. Think about books, think about art history, good places to start, and then find what you like. Find, most importantly though, what's appropriate for your market if you're trying to make a product that you're trying to sell. A little bit along these lines, I did recently, there's a great website for this stuff as well, called Form Trends, and I just did a little chat with Eric Galena over there. It's his website. I'll put a little link in the description of this video, so there's a little interview over there I did talking about design and books and that sort of thing. So hope you find this helpful. Try to expand on it with some more hands-on demos and examples in the coming months. But this, I think, hopefully get you started and start to think about form language in a more sort of analytical fashion. It's something you can research, and then it's something you can try to apply back to whatever subject you're doing, whether it's graphic design or industrial design or fine art, but always with an eye towards an end audience. So hope that helps, and have a great week, and go read a book and get inspired. Bye-bye.